Hey everyone. I'm checking to see. Let's see. I think I can make this bigger. Where are we at? Hi. This is Lorena from Synergy Behavior Solutions, and I am wanting to cover sort of a controversial topic. Maybe I don't know. I feel like it shouldn't be controversial at this point, but people still seem to kind of cling to some outdated ideas when it comes to understanding the behavior of these canine Canis familiaris animals that we live with, and I wanted to address the notion of dominance or dominance theory, or the idea that you have to be the alpha of your dog's household or pack or whatever words you might be using for that. Um, and The notion of hierarchy in general, in terms of not only how it affects um, the historical understanding and the way that we understand dog behavior, but also how it affects our training methodologies and what it can do when we sort of try to apply that framework to interacting with these pet dogs often, or even sport dogs or hunting dogs, or however dogs tend to be in your home and in your life. So first, I just want to tell a little story. So I grew up on a petting zoo, a farm. We had a ton of different kinds of animals, lots of exotic animals, and we'd had a lot of dogs. And so, because of the ideas of dominance theory being pretty pervasive in the 90s and the early 2000s, especially around the time when I was fairly young, that was sort of how we collectively understood. Hey, Diana. Good morning. That was sort of how we understood our pack of dogs in my own family's home, and we had up to 9 rescue dogs at a time. And I would say that my mom is an amazing animal manager when it comes to managing a safe household with that many dogs, and we all got really good at that. And still, as somebody who has been obsessed with dogs from a very young age, like I was the kid who had the dog book that I carried everywhere with me, and I would photocopy pages of it to hang in my room, and talked about dogs all the time and pretended to be a dog for several years of my life. And so, always been really into dogs, and just assumed that dominance was how I was supposed to understand their interactions. And so, when I went away to college, I got my first dog, so the one that was mine, and as an adult. And I still have him. He's 10 years old now. His name is Summer. He's a St. Bernard mix. I adopted him as a little 8-week, 10-week-old puppy. And he was the first dog that I had that lunged and barked at other dogs on leash, starting when he was about a year old. And at the time, I had actually, when he was younger as a puppy, I had actually hired a fairly well known, I'm not going to say the name of the company, but it's a company here in the States that's pretty well known, and that if I did say their name, you might have heard of them. I hired them to come to my house and teach me stuff about how to train my new puppy. And their entire philosophy was based on the idea. They even had like a chart that they would show me of the dog being at the top of this pyramid, and then me being below them and all the other members of the household. And so the dog was trying to, was through its behavior, being the leader or the alpha and controlling the household social dynamic. And so what I needed to do, hi Scott, and so this trainer told me that what I needed to do was to make sure that I was correcting my dog for behaviors that were based in this needing to achieve status sort of notion. And fortunately, just a few weeks after they got me growling at my dog and doing strange things to him, to my puppy, I stumbled across clicker training. And so Wonder Puppy here in Portland is a really great puppy resource, and I took some of their classes, and my dog was so much more receptive to it that I shifted my attention that way. By the time Summer was about a year old and he was lunging and barking at other dogs on leash, I realized really quickly that I did not know anything about dogs, even though I had spent my life with dogs being my favorite animal. So, through some calls and some research, I actually ended up taking Synergy Behavior Solutions Reactive Rover class almost a decade ago, so 8 years ago or something. And I realized through that class that everything that I thought I knew about dogs was wrong. And that sort of has brought me to where I am now. And I think that one of the most damaging things that I believed when I was younger was that my dog was trying to establish dominance, or that through their behavior they were trying to move up in the hierarchy, whatever that might mean. So, having said that, I do not in any way ascribe to that theory anymore, and I'm pretty adamant about trying to dispel those notions because of the damaging effects they have on our relationships with our dogs, and also on the harm that they actually. It's okay, Scott. I like to say hi to everybody who shows up. Hi, Michelle. Thanks for joining. And so what I want to talk about real quick is the origins of how this theory sort of came into the mainstream consciousness. I think that more people these days, the average person, believes this to be true than not. And the reasons for that are, so back in like the 30s and 40s, there was this researcher, a Swiss researcher, his name was Rudolf Schenkel. And he spent some time observing a group of captive wolves in a pen-like setting. They had like a fair amount of space, but they were not in their natural setting. And there are other things that I'm going to talk about that were problematic with the study. But while he was observing these wolves, he saw lots of aggressive interactions. He saw lots of fighting over resources. They seemed to be in a constant struggle for having access to things like food, prime sleeping spots, safe spots, access to each other, whatever that might look like. And he concluded that it was through the aggressive behavior of the so-called alpha male and female of the pack, so the two seemingly most powerful animals, or the ones that had the most access to resources through this type of adversarial and like competitive behavior. He concluded that it was through their aggressive behavior that they would maintain order in the pack. So other researchers after that actually confirmed his findings and were like, yeah, that Rudolph guy, he knows what he's talking about, because we also observed groups of captive wolves and we saw the same behavior. So really important components when we think about and we look at those studies, of which there were only a few, and since then there have been many more studies that show a very different relationship when it comes to natural interactions between wolves, which I'll talk about shortly. But some of the things to think about: all of these wolves were unrelated. They did not know each other and they came from different areas. That is not how wolves live. They were mostly males, and they were fighting over resources because they were in a small enclosed space. They did not all have access to resources, and they did not have the ability to perform natural behaviors that wolves would perform in the wild. So since then, there was a researcher, he's pretty famous. If you know any biologist's names, except maybe for Farley Moat from Never Cry Wolf, the only other biologist that a lot of people may know in terms of wolf-related research, of course Jane Goodall is another one, but she's not about wolves, is David Mech. And David Mech is credited, at least, with a large portion of the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park. So a lot of the resurgence of wolves in the United States after they had been almost decimated is credited to David Mech and his research team and the incredible work that they'd done. He also wrote a book in the 90s called The Ecology and Biology of an Endangered Species, which was like the Bible for a lot of folks who were getting really excited about the reintroduction of wolves. That said, David Mech has since gone on record, and there's videos of him on YouTube, explicitly stating and redacting some of the things that he actually wrote in that book related to conclusions drawn from Rudolf Schenkel's studies. And so, having observed wolves in the real world, he now knows that that most of those interactions and the behaviors they were observing are not typical, and the opposite is generally true. So wolf packs, if you want to know, wolf packs are comprised of a male and female that are a breeding pair and their offspring. So it is a family unit, and they tend to have a very wide roaming range, like hundreds of miles. And the offspring will stay actually with their parents for several years, sometimes up to like 4 years or so, if depending on the studies you look at. And then each one of those will go off and be a lone wolf for a little while until they find their breeding mate, and then they create their own family. So we're literally just talking about a family structure. And super interesting thing to think about too is that in healthy relationships in a wolf pack, or a wolf family as it is, a family unit, these the way that they interact with each other is actually based on voluntary deference, not on coercion. So what I mean by voluntary deference is the way that as highly social animals and evolutionarily social animals, canines in general, are actually designed to diffuse conflict, not to create it. So a dominance theory would say that animals challenge each other in order to get status or resources, but that's not actually how you work together. A lot of things that we can take from that for how to live as humans, but maybe that's a different live for a different day. And so a healthy relationship and healthy canines will do a lot of deference to, like, I don't care that much about that resource, but you care about it, so you have it. Oh, you want to go through that doorway first? That's fine. I don't care that much. I'm actually not chewing on that bone anymore, so go ahead and take it. So you'll see a lot of that if you actually objectively and calmly and without judgment observe interactions between dogs. It is a lot of diffusing situations and a lot of like, nah, it's cool, man. And the more that we see that, the more that we see that dominance theory is the opposite of how canines actually interact. So, having talked about wolves and the fact that that alpha theory is not a thing even for wolves, now we can talk about dogs. So, dogs are not wolves. They share a lot of the same genetic material for sure, like almost down to, I think it's like 0.1% difference or something. And even in that 0.1% is the like massive and incredible genetic difference between breeds. Dogs are just amazing animals, but they're not wolves. And there have actually been plenty of studies on feral dogs and street dogs, particularly in Turkey and other places where it's well known that there are just dogs roaming around everywhere and they're kind of just part of the landscape in a lot of these cities. And dogs are actually even less hierarchical and more loosely organized than wolves are. And so even in that situation, there's not even really family units. There's just like a mama might have some puppies, but that doesn't mean that dad's around. And they tend to have one-on-one interactions, like maybe they're like friends. Sometimes the friends will hang out, but often they're loners and they do their own thing. They come together to eat and to mate. And there's lots and lots of positive and deferential interactions between these animals. And otherwise, they don't hang out together. They don't have complicated social hierarchies. So, having said all of that, dominance theory is not true. It's not true for wolves. It's not true for dogs. But more importantly to me is the fact that dominance theory is based on an approach that is adversarial and competitive by nature. So it's kind of this is kind of a lot to say, but I feel like it's sort of a reflection of our society's obsession with punishment in general. But it definitely is sort of this this idea that if we really believe that my dog, who right now is adorably sleeping in her bed, if I really believe that she is trying to gain power in an interaction, if I ascribe this sort of overarching scheme or plan to her behavior, that is going to necessitate that I will be using aversive interactions to get her to stop that, or to like suppress her behavior and to suppress her need for power or for dominance or whatever we want to say it is. And so because dominance theory necessitates punishment-based interactions and punishment-based training, it can be really harmful to the way that we interact with our dogs and the way that we explain their behavior. So we know for a fact, this is just, at this point, it's not really something that we can debate, that punishment-based training hurts the animal's welfare and is not as effective as positive reinforcement-based training. It's just true. There's enough studies at this point, we can just see it. And so it's not something that I necessarily will argue about anymore, but something that that can be helpful is that people tend to want to use dominance theory and the idea of like, well, they cling to punishment-based training or to correction-based training because it makes us tell these erroneous and harmful stories about our dogs. So rather than looking at behavior as just behavior, something that happens, dominance theory and correction-based training sort of ascribes like a moral judgment to the behavior. So there's a lot of like, well, he needs to know what he did wrong, or he knows that he's not supposed to do that. Or my dog counter surfs because he's trying to take advantage of me. He knows he's not supposed to. That's why he only does it when I'm not looking. Although, if you know about behavior, you know there's a very different way to explain that type of behavior. They might say things like, or we might say things like, he fights my other dog because he's the alpha and he wants to control the other dog. When, if we know about behavior and the way that dogs that are healthy and well socialized interact, we know that it's actually the dogs that lack confidence and that are stressed that are the ones that are reacting aggressively. And so it's actually kind of flips the whole notion on its head if we really look at what is the animal telling us with their behavior when we're thinking in terms of like reinforcement and punishment. And so if reinforcement drives behavior, and it does, and by that I mean we perform behaviors as beings, as organisms, to access things and to get things that are pleasurable or necessary for life. And that desire for reinforcement, that chasing of reinforcement, that overrides punishment like every time at some point. And so a lot of people will, again, in wanting to ascribe these sort of like stories about how we interact with our dogs, there's a lot of like, oh, I don't want to spoil my dog, or he needs to know his place. And these are so based in this this kind of binary thinking of like of what is right and what is wrong. And if we can start to sort of dismantle and break down those notions and just look at the behavior for what it is, like my dog sleeping in her bed, or on my bed, which she's absolutely allowed to do, and she has not yet taken over the world. Although if you've met Yoshi, she might have taken over my world, but different story. And so if we think about it in terms of what is the dog doing and what are they trying to access to do that? If we look at that as some abstract concept of the dog is trying to access power, then we are going to be tempted to suppress that behavior. And we do that through punishment or coercion or fear, intimidation, etc. But if we also look at it as like the dog is trying to get a need met. So how can I help the dog get that need met and be a little bit more of a benevolent leader? Because as dog guardians, we control every single aspect of our dog's lives. We decide when, where, what they eat. We decide when they go to the bathroom. We decide where they go. We decide where they walk, what they sniff, what they look at. We make every single choice that dictates our dog's needs. And if that doesn't mean that we're in charge, then I don't know what does. So if you are somehow worried that your dog is trying to take over your household, it's really not a concern, because at this point you do dictate and decide everything that happens to your dog, and they are well aware of that. Your dog knows that you are not a dog. They are fully aware of that. And they do not even interact with us the way that they interact with other dogs. So we know for a fact that they know we're not dogs. So having said that, I think that what I would like for folks to take away from this talk is that rather than trying to ascribe a particular ulterior motive or some kind of hierarchical explanation to your dog's behavior, I think it's really helpful to think more about what is my dog trying to get, what need is my dog trying to get met, and how can I assist them in doing that in a way that I have arbitrarily deemed as appropriate. The dog is never wrong. So this is actually why I don't like to get into conversations also with folks who say like, well, if you use positive reinforcement, how do you tell the dog when he's done something wrong? The dog is just being a dog. The dog is just doing behavior, and it's not right or wrong. We get to decide, because we have the power to do so, we get to decide what is reinforced and what isn't. And so we can manage the environment to make that a lot easier for our dogs to make the choice that we would like them to make. If you want to learn more about this kind of training, and if you're interested in the incredible things that you can do with positive reinforcement once we do things like ditch the notion of punishment and alpha theory and dominance-based stuff, we are offering a ton of online classes. We do lives here every Tuesday and Thursday about various topics where we do demos, etc. And we're happy to talk about any of this stuff within reason and with people who are interested in having like an honest conversation with integrity. And yeah, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate your time and attention. Hello, Eileen. And I hope you have a lovely day. Please feel free to drop any thoughts or comments or observations into the comments. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this, or maybe even your journey with it. Like, I have no shame in talking about how I hired an aversive trainer when I was in college because I didn't know any better. And I also thought that dominance was 100% a thing. And it's been really liberating in so many ways, especially for my dogs, for me to move away from those, from that kind of framework of thinking. So, have a great day, and you all are awesome.